The blessing ceremony was supposed to take 20 minutes. It took 12 seconds to reopen a 31-year blood debt. Mireille Whitmore stood at the edge of the courtyard at Baekhwa House with a clipboard she didn't need, watching the low autumn sun cut gold across 200 folding chairs, and told herself this was just another item on the run sheet. Family blessing, private, 4 o'clock to 4:20, archive team not required to attend. She had come anyway, because she managed everything that happened on these grounds, including the things that weren't technically hers to manage. 3 years of running this estate had taught her that the small print items, the ones marked not required, were usually the ones worth watching. The courtyard had been dressed for the occasion in white orchids and pale gold ribbon, the kind of understated luxury that cost more than most people's rent. And the 200 folding chairs held the extended edges of a family that rarely gathered this openly. Choi cousins from San Francisco, port directors, security captains, and business partners who were not, strictly, family, but who had been seated close enough to the front to understand that they were meant to notice this. Mireille recognized the choreography of it even before she understood what it was choreographing. This was not a private moment. This was syndicate theatre dressed as family tradition, staged for an audience carefully selected for what they would repeat across ports, boardrooms, and private dining rooms. Choi Jae-won stood at the center of it in a charcoal suit, one hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who came up to his ribs. Minho, 8 years old, solemn as a small judge, dressed in a miniature version of his father's jacket, his hair combed with a precision that told Mireille someone had spent 20 minutes on it that morning and that the boy had held very still, wanting to get it right. Unibike stood a pace behind them, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, watching her son the way people watch something they are afraid to want too openly, as if hoping might jinx it. Choi Soo-ah sat in the front row in ivory silk, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, watching not her grandson but her son, with an attentiveness Mireille had learned, over 3 years, to read as something closer to supervision than affection. "This belonged to a man who once saved my father's life," Jae-won said, and his voice carried without effort across the courtyard, the way voices do when a man commands freight routes, private security, and men who listen before he finishes speaking. 31 years ago, before most of you were part of this family, before I was old enough to understand what my father owed the world, a man did something for this house that changed what was possible for all of us. A man named Robert Whitmore. It's time his name found a new purpose here. He opened a small velvet box and lifted out a gold pocket watch on a worn chain, the metal catching the low sun in a way that made several of the seated cousins murmur appreciatively. The way people murmur at objects they understand to be valuable without understanding why. Mireille's clipboard hit the ground. She knew that watch. She had seen it exactly once, in a photograph curling at the edges in a shoebox under her father's bed, her father at 28, grinning, one arm slung around a man Mireille had never been told the name of, the watch glinting at his vest pocket. Both of them looking like men who had just gotten away with something enormous. She had asked her father about it once, years ago, half joking, sprawled on the floor of his den with the shoebox between them, is that a Rolex, Daddy and he had gone quiet in the specific way she'd learned young not to push on. The way that meant a door had opened somewhere and he'd chosen, deliberately, to close it again. "It's not mine to explain," he'd said, and put the photograph back at the bottom of the box like a man returning something borrowed. Not yet. He had died 4 years later, of a heart attack in his own kitchen, without ever finishing that sentence. She stepped forward without deciding to, some animal part of her simply refusing to stay where it had been standing. Close enough to read the engraving, Jae-won turned absently in his fingers before he handed it to his son. R.C. Courage endures. Her father's initials. Her father's watch. In this man's hand, in front of 200 witnesses, being given to a child who was not hers. Near the back wall, old Park Dae-sung, who had stood guard at every Choi family function for 3 decades without once, to Mireille's knowledge, showing an expression beyond mild, professional attention went rigid. His jaw locked. His eyes moved from the watch to Mireille's face and stayed there. And for one unguarded moment, the old man looked like he'd seen something walk back out of the ground it had been buried in. Jae-won noticed neither of them. He closed his son's small hand around the watch, crouched slightly so their eyes were level, and said something quiet that didn't carry past the first row. and the gathered family began, softly, to applaud the particular polite applause of people confirming, to each other, that they had witnessed something they were meant to remember as generous. Mireille did not applaud. She stood very still, doing the math her body had already started doing before her mind caught up. That is my father's watch, in a box, in this family's vault, given away in front of 200 people, as though it belonged to no one, as though it had simply been waiting there for the right ceremony to justify handing it off, and understood, with the specific cold clarity of a woman whose entire job was noticing what other people missed, that something here had been arranged to look simple, and was not simple at all. Somewhere behind that watch was a story nobody in this courtyard had been invited to hear, and she intended to be the one who heard it. The applause thinned into champagne and low conversation. Mireille found herself moving through the crowd on autopilot, murmuring logistics to caterers, until she reached the shade at the edge of the terrace where Jae-won stood alone for the first time all afternoon, watching his son show the watch to a cluster of cousins. "Where did that come from?" she said. Not a question, a demand dressed as one, because that was the only volume she trusted herself with right now. He turned, caught the controlled shock in her face, and set his glass down before she had finished speaking. "The vault. It's been there as long as I can remember. Why? Do you know whose initials those are?" "RC. He frowned, searching. "My father mentioned a man once, years ago. Someone who did us a great service. I don't know the whole story. My mother handles the old records." He looked at her more closely. "Mireille, what's wrong?" she almost told him. She had the sentence "built my father's name" was Robert Whitmore, and she watched it die in her mouth because some old, tired part of her did not want to hand him her grief in the middle of his son's party, did not want to be the woman who made this moment about herself. That was the shape her whole life had taken. Be useful, be composed, don't ask, don't need. "Nothing," she said. "I need to check on the archive room. The humidity control's been acting up." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the truth, and she felt the lie's small, familiar shame settle into her chest as she walked away. Behind her, Park Dae-sung watched her go, one hand pressed to the wall like a man steadying himself against grief. Jae-won saw him. Before returning to the ceremony, he quietly ordered his security chief to preserve every vault access ledger, ceremonial inventory, and household authorization connected to the watch. He gave one further instruction. His mother was not to be told. She drove home that night to the small house in Culver City her father had left her, the one she still hadn't found the heart to sell or fully move into, half furnished for 4 years, the way people leave rooms when finishing them feels like admitting the person isn't coming back. She sat on the floor of his den, the way she had as a girl, and pulled the shoebox out from under the shelf where she'd stored it after the funeral, the cardboard gone soft at the corners. The photograph was exactly where she remembered it. Her father at 28, in a collared shirt gone thin at the elbows, grinning at whoever held the camera, one arm slung around a younger man whose face she had never once, in 28 years of being his daughter, been told the name of. She had always assumed the man was a friend from the auto shop, someone lost to time the way old friendships get lost. She had never once imagined he might belong to a family, with a courtyard full of orchids and a vault 2 floors below a mansion she managed for a living. It's not mine to explain. Not yet. Her father's voice, faint and specific, the way voices stay specific even years after the person is gone. She had spent 4 years assuming that sentence meant nothing, an old man's private joke, a story he'd forgotten to finish before his heart gave out over the stove one Tuesday morning. It had never once occurred to her that not yet might have had an actual date attached to it, a moment he'd been waiting for that had simply arrived 4 years too late, in a courtyard, without him. She did not cry. She had never been much good at crying in ways other people could see. She sat with the photograph until the light in the den went from orange to grey, and then she put it carefully in her bag, because tomorrow, for the first time in 4 years, she intended to go looking for the rest of the sentence herself. The archive wing lived 2 floors below the main house, climate-controlled and guarded by 2 coded doors, lined with cedar cabinets holding 90 years of Choi correspondence, port ledgers, territorial agreements, private settlements, and heirlooms Mireille had spent 3 years cataloguing into a system nobody before her had ever bothered to build. It was the work she was proudest of, the work that made order out of a dynasty, built equally on legitimate contracts and carefully buried violence. The work she had let herself believe made her indispensable in a house where good staff survived by becoming invisible. She pulled the master inventory for the vault. It took 40 minutes of cross-referencing before she found the line. Item 114, gentleman's pocket watch, gold, engraved RC, acquired 1994. Provenance, family gift, unclaimed. Unclaimed. She stared at the word until it stopped looking like English. Her father had died 4 years ago of a heart attack in his own kitchen, in a house he owned outright, with a daughter who visited every Sunday. He had not misplaced a watch and forgotten to claim it. Somebody had written that word into a family ledger on purpose. She thought of asking Jae-won outright, and then thought of the ceremony, the 200 witnesses, the boy wearing her father's initials around his neck like a blessing, and felt something in her go quiet and hard and very careful. If this had been buried once, on purpose, she wanted to know by whom and why, before she said a single word that could be buried again. She pulled the original physical ledger from the cedar cabinet rather than trusting the digitized copy alone, a habit she'd built into the archive's protocol precisely because digital transcriptions smoothed over the small physical tells that mattered. The book itself was heavier than she remembered, bound in cracked green leather, its pages a careful cursive that ran consistently from 1960 through the early 2000s in the same hand. The same pressure, the same slight leftward slant that belonged, she now knew from 3 years of cataloguing, to the old family secretary who had kept these records until his own retirement. The 1994 entry didn't match that hand at all. She laid a magnifier over the page the way she'd been trained to for insurance appraisals. The ink was a slightly different black, the letters more upright, more deliberate, as if written by someone unused to holding a fountain pen the way the old secretary had. She pulled 3 other pages from the same year for comparison, and found the same secretary's looping hand on every one of them except this single line, squeezed in below an otherwise finished entry, in ink that hadn't quite matched the surrounding page even when it was new. She was still at the desk at 8 that night, the 1994 page open beside a stack of comparison samples, when the shape of it finally settled into place. This wasn't a smudge of history. This was a specific, deliberate insertion, made by someone with access to a locked archive and a reason to make an unclaimed debt disappear into a single bureaucratic word. Someone had gone back and changed the story after the fact, and they had done it carefully enough that no one, not her, not anyone before her, had ever been meant to notice. She called her closest friend from the archival program she'd trained in, a woman named Denise, who now ran collections for a small university library and had never once, in a decade of friendship, let Mireille get away with talking herself out of her own feelings. "You're doing the thing," Denise said, before Mireille had finished explaining. "The thing where you gather every piece of evidence in the world before you'll admit out loud that you're angry." "I'm not angry. I'm being thorough, Mireille. Your father's watch was handed to a stranger's child in front of 200 people, and you found out about it standing next to a caterer. You're allowed to be angry before you've built a legal case for it." Denise's voice softened. "I know you've spent your whole career believing that if you're careful enough, good enough, quiet enough, people will finally give you what you're owed without you having to ask for it out loud. I've watched you do it for 10 years. It's never once worked the way you hoped it would. Maybe this is the time you stop waiting to earn the right to be upset." Mireille sat with that longer than she wanted to admit. "And if I ask, and they still don't give it to me?" "Then at least you'll know you asked," Denise said, "which is more than that watch ever got to do for 30 years. She found Park Dae-sung the next morning at the edge of the property, doing his slow circuit of the perimeter fence, a routine he'd kept since before Mireille was born. "Mr. Park." She fell into step beside him, matching his pace instead of blocking it, the way you approach an animal you don't want to spook. "Yesterday, at the ceremony, you looked like you'd seen a ghost." His jaw worked. For a long moment she thought he would simply keep walking, the way men of his generation and his loyalty often did, letting silence do the refusing for them. Then he stopped. "Robert," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. That was your father's name. I recognized the shape of your face at the funeral of a man I never met, because I saw a photograph of him once, 30 years ago, in a folder I was told to forget existed. Mireille's pulse went very loud. Tell me. I can't. He looked at her with something that might have been the closest thing to an apology a man like him allowed himself. I made a promise. Not to Madame Choi, to the old master, before he died. I was told the truth would come out when it was time, and that I was not the one who got to decide when that was. You've been keeping a promise to a dead man for 30 years. I've been keeping a lot of promises to a lot of dead men for 30 years, Park said, with the flat, tired honesty of a man who had spent his whole working life standing quietly near other people's secrets. It's the job. You learn which silences are yours to keep, and which ones are just convenient for somebody else to have kept for them. I've spent a long time not being sure which kind this one was. He looked out at the fence line, not at her. I was 29, newly hired. I was in the second car the night it happened, a routine drive, or so we thought, until it wasn't. Your father wasn't Choi family. He wasn't security. He was a mechanic who happened to be working underneath a car, 3 spaces down in a parking structure, when he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. He didn't call anyone. He didn't wait for someone qualified. He just did what needed doing, with his hands, in about 4 minutes, while the rest of us were still working out who to call. His jaw tightened. The old master offered him money. A great deal of it. Your father wouldn't take it. Said the only thing he wanted was for the family to remember, if it ever mattered, that a stranger did right by them once. That's the whole of what I know. What happened to that promise after the old master died, that part isn't mine to explain either. But someone in this house decided, remember was a debt they'd rather not keep paying. Someone gave that watch away yesterday like it was theirs to give. It was never theirs to give, Park said, and for one unguarded second his composure cracked entirely. It was collateral, held, not owned. There's a difference, and somebody in this family decided a long time ago that the difference was inconvenient. He straightened, visibly reassembling himself. I've said more than I should. Ask Madame Choi about 1994. Ask her about a car that didn't explode. That's all I can give you. He walked on before she could ask another question, leaving her standing at the fence line with a name 1994 and a shape of a story with the center still missing. Drop your city below if you've ever found out the truth about someone only after they were gone. A car that didn't explode. It took Mireille 2 days, and a favor called in from a former colleague at the county records office to find what she was looking for. A 1-paragraph item buried in a 1994 Metro brief. No names, no follow-up, the kind of story that ran once and was never mentioned again because the people involved had the resources to make sure it wasn't. Suspicious device found and disarmed in downtown parking structure. No injuries reported. Investigation ongoing. No arrests. No further coverage. The kind of silence that only happens when someone with enough money decides a story is more useful buried than told. She found the retired secretary next, the man whose careful, consistent cursive filled every other page of the ledger she'd been living inside for a week. He was 81, sharp-eyed, living in a modest bungalow in Glendale, and he remembered the year immediately when she said it aloud. 1994 was the year Madame Choi took over the household records, he told her. Over tea he insisted on making himself. Before that, everything ran through me. After, certain pages started coming back to me already filled in, ready for filing, in a hand that wasn't mine and wasn't meant to be questioned. I asked once, early on, why an entry I hadn't written had my initials pre-approved beside it. I was told the matter was closed, and that closed things stayed closed in that house. He looked at her with something like sympathy. I always wondered whose name got quietly rewritten that year. I'm sorry it was yours to find out. It was the third piece of the same shape, the news brief, the guard's fragment, the secretary's memory, and none of them, alone, would have been enough. Together, they were unmistakable. Someone had taken a private debt and made it disappear from the record within months of inheriting control of that record, and had done it so carefully that 30 years had passed before anyone thought to look. It took her 4 days after that to build the courage to bring it to Jae-won properly, and when she finally did, she brought paper. She laid the ledger photocopy on his desk along with a photograph she'd finally retrieved from her father's old shoebox, Robert Whitmore, 28, arm around a younger version of a man whose bone structure was unmistakably, painfully, Jae-won's father's. "That's my father," she said. "Robert Whitmore. The man whose initials are on the watch you gave your son in front of 200 people. Jae-won went very still. He picked up the photograph, then opened the black folder already waiting at his elbow. Inside were copies of the vault access ledger, the ceremonial inventory, and a 1994 authorization bearing Sua's household seal. He had not waited for Mireille to prove that her shock mattered. He had started looking the moment she walked away from the courtyard. "Unclaimed," he read, placing her photocopy beside his own. The same word appeared on both pages, but only one carried his mother's approval mark. Mireille. I didn't know whose watch it was. I knew, after I saw Park's face, that somebody had lied about it. "I believe you didn't know it was my father's. I don't believe nobody in this house knew the watch wasn't a gift." She kept her voice even because Even was the only register she trusted, though her folded hands were not as steady. "Your mother let you hand it to your son with an unpaid debt attached, in front of 200 people, including me, while I learned that my father's name mattered to this family only after it was too late to ask him why." Jae-won's jaw tightened. The authorization proves she moved it from collateral storage into ceremonial inventory. It doesn't prove why. The handwriting proves someone rewrote the story. The ceremony proves someone wanted the rewritten version witnessed. Mireille leaned forward. "And I think you already know whose signature has approved every private change to this archive since 1994. You're asking me to say her name because saying it yourself changes what happens to the succession." He did not deny it. Beyond the study windows, 2 black security vehicles crossed the lower drive, part of the preparations for the transfer that would place the family's ports, freight companies, private security network, and shadow agreements under his command. "My father used to say a man saved his life once and asked for nothing," he said. "He never gave me the name. I assumed it was one of those stories powerful families polish until nobody can separate gratitude from legend." He closed the folder. "I have ordered a full internal audit. Nobody destroys, moves, or edits a record. Not my mother. Not me. But I need 3 days to confront her before the council turns this into a succession war." It was a reasonable request wrapped around an old danger, and she felt the familiar instinct rise: trust the powerful man, let him control the timetable, call patience virtue, and for once, standing in his study with her father's photograph between them, she refused to disappear inside somebody else's strategy. 3 days, she said, "not because you outrank me, because I can see you're finally doing something. At the end of those 3 days, the truth goes to the council, whether you're ready or not." "It will," he said. She believed that he meant it. She still took the photograph with her when she left. Choi Sua received her in the tea room 3 days later, choosing her own ground after avoidance had only given Mireille time to gather proof. The room carried the same calculated elegance as the Courtyard 1 low table, 2 chairs, afternoon light arranged to expose the guest while leaving the host in shadow. Even conversation became choreography in Sua's hands. "Jae-won tells me you've mistaken access for authority," she said, pouring tea. "You were hired to preserve this family's records, not weaponize them. The watch belonged to my father. The watch entered our vault under my husband's protection. That made it family property. No, it made your family responsible for it." Sua's eyes lifted. "Your father gave my husband 4 minutes of courage and spent the next 30 years governing him from a distance. Every port dispute, every retaliatory decision, every man my husband had to trust or remove, he asked what Robert Whitmore would have done. He kept your father's photograph in his private drawer as if a stranger's judgment mattered more than the woman who built this house beside him. There it was, resentment preserved so carefully it had hardened into policy. You punished my father because your husband respected him. I protected my son from inheriting another man's shadow." Sua set down the pot. "The succession transfers shipping companies, security divisions, political debts, territorial promises, and the loyalty of men who test weakness for a living. The San Francisco branch already believes Jae-won is too cautious. If the council learns that the Choi line survived because a mechanic acted while our security failed, they will smell fracture. So you erased the man who saved your husband. I removed a vulnerability. You converted a debt into stolen property." Sua's expression tightened. I gave the watch to Minho because his position had to be undeniable before the transfer. A recognized son wearing a Choi heirloom before every branch creates a fact no rival can easily challenge. The object had outlived the man who left it. I gave it a useful future. Mireille understood that Suar had confessed without believing confession was weakness. You moved the watch from collateral storage, altered the ledger, then placed it on a child whose need to belong guaranteed nobody would ask whether the gift was yours. You did not protect Minho. You used him as a lock on a stolen story. For the first time, Suar's hand stopped before reaching her cup. Be careful! If you force this before the council, men who have waited years to divide Jae-won's authority will use your father's name as their banner. Then Jae-won can prove whether he deserves the authority you keep protecting. My father gets his name back either way. You think truth makes powerful people honest? No, Mireille said. I think evidence makes dishonest people expensive. The answer landed harder than anger. Suar looked toward the shaded window, calculating routes closing one by one. Mireille saw the instant she understood intimidation would not restore the old balance. This was never a blessing ceremony, Mireille said. It was evidence disposal disguised as love. You built it out of a boy's trust, and now the same witnesses who applauded will learn what they were asked to bless. Suar's silence was no longer composure. It was the silence of a strategist hearing her own plan described accurately enough to become an indictment. The truth, once it cracked open, complicated rather than resolved. Baekhwa found Mireille in the archive wing 2 days later, uninvited, her composure fraying at the edges. I need to know what's happening, she said. Suar told me the watch would secure Minho's place permanently. She told me it was already settled, that no one could ever question his position after this, that all I had to do was let him wear it in front of the family, and everything after that would take care of itself. Now Jae-won isn't returning my calls, and there are whispers about a scandal with your father's name in it, and I have a son who wears that watch to bed because he thinks his father finally chose him publicly, in front of everyone, the way he's been waiting 3 years for someone to choose him. Her voice cracked. Did she use my son to bury something? Mireille looked at this woman, not an enemy. She understood now. But another person, Suar, had positioned like a piece on a board without asking. She thought of every assumption she'd been carrying about Yuna since the ceremony. Every quiet, unexamined resentment she hadn't let herself look at directly, and made herself set them down. I think she used both of us, Mireille said quietly. You, to make an old debt disappear behind a family celebration no one would dare question. Because a mother fighting for her son's belonging is the last person anyone in that courtyard would think to doubt. Me, because taking my father's name off the record decades ago meant that when the moment came to erase it for good, there was no name left to defend. Your son's blessing wasn't uncomplicated. It was built to look uncomplicated. That's not the same thing. Yuna sat down hard in the archive chair, all the fight going out of her at once. I told him 3 years ago I didn't want Minho to grow up feeling like a consolation prize, like the son from the arrangement nobody talks about at dinner. Suar told me this would fix that a public gesture, witnessed, undeniable, would make his place permanent in a way private promises never could. A bitter, wet laugh. She used my son's need to belong as a shovel. And I let her, because I wanted so badly to believe there was an easy version of this where my son never had to feel what I felt for 8 years. What do you want to do now? I want my son to keep the one object his father has ever given him in front of witnesses, Yuna said, wiping her face with the heel of her hand. Taking it back now would only prove to him that even the good things get taken away without explanation, and he's had enough of that already. But I want the truth to come out anyway, all of it. Even the parts that make me look like I let myself be used. He deserves a father who tells him the truth more than he deserves an easy story with his name in the wrong ledger line. She met Mireille's eyes, steadier now. I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth from someone who's been part of the problem without meaning to be. It was worth something. Mireille found, to her own surprise, that she believed her. That night, alone in the half-furnished Culver City house her father had left her, Mireille finally asked a question more dangerous than what was fair. What did she want after the truth came out? Fair was simple. Correct the ledger. Restore Robert Whitmore's name. Make the family acknowledge, before witnesses, that the watch had been held in trust and deliberately misrepresented. She could win those things, re-sign the next morning, and never again enter Baekhwa House. The guarded part of her called that dignity. The frightened part called it safety. But leaving would also return the archive to people who had spent 31 years treating history as private property. Revenge was clean because it ended. Responsibility was messier. It required staying long enough to defend the change after the applause faded and the council found new reasons to prefer convenience. She wanted the truth to cost Suar something real. She wanted the succession to prove that power could survive honesty. She wanted independent authority over the records she had built, not as compensation from Jae-won, but because nobody in that family had earned the right to supervise her silence again. And beneath those professional demands sat the one desire she disliked admitting. She wanted to discover whether Jae-won could become the man he had begun pretending not to be, one who acted before she carried the whole burden alone, one who asked instead of decided, one who could stand beside her without turning protection into possession. That was not forgiveness. It was not romance, not yet. It was simply the refusal to abandon something she had built because other people had corrupted it. For most of her life, Mireille had made herself indispensable by needing nothing. Now she wanted authority, accountability, and the right to be fully visible while claiming both. She wrote those 3 words on the back of a copied ledger page and left them on her father's desk until morning. If you've ever discovered someone you thought was your enemy was actually being used the same way you were, drop the word that describes that feeling. Jae-won came to the archive after midnight with his jacket over one arm and 3 sealed folders in the other. Mireille was still beneath the single working lamp, surrounded by 30 years of paper. I confronted her, he said. Then I verified what she admitted. The first folder contained Suar's 1994 authorization moving the watch from protected collateral into unclaimed property. The second held her recent order, transferring it into ceremonial inventory before Minho's blessing. The third was a succession memorandum from the San Francisco branch arguing that any delay should trigger an emergency vote on Jae-won's fitness to lead. She knew what the ceremony would accomplish, he said. She also knew my rivals would use any challenge against me. What did you do? I froze the succession timetable, removed my mother's archive access, and ordered every branch captain before the council in 4 days. Nobody moves a contract, a security team, or $1 under the excuse that leadership is uncertain. That was the answer Mireille had wanted, not regret presented as action, but action carrying consequences. She told me about the car, your father, and the way mine measured every hard decision against Robert Whitmore's 4 minutes of courage. She resented the debt because it forced him to admit this family survived through someone else's bravery. And you? I called silence protection because control felt safer than honesty. He sat across from her. That belief denied my father the chance to repay his debt openly. It left you investigating your own grief while I prepared to inherit power built partly on your father's erased name. How's that belief working out? Badly. No self-pity softened it. I am not asking forgiveness because I found the correct language for what I did. I am telling you the system has already changed, and the council will decide the rest with the evidence visible. Mireille opened the second folder. Suar's signature sat beneath a typed instruction, suitable for public heirloom presentation. What happens when the San Francisco branch moves against you? They will. Jae-won's mouth hardened. They have mistaken my willingness to expose my own house for weakness. I will let them make that mistake in front of everyone. For the first time, Mireille saw the Mafia boss beneath the controlled air, not in threats or volume, but in his calm acceptance that truth would create enemies. My father's debt gets repaid publicly, he said. Your authority over the archive becomes independent. My mother answers to the council. Minho keeps the watch after learning whose courage it represents. You decided that without asking me. I decided what I will propose. I came to ask what you require. The distinction mattered. So did the fact that, for once, he waited, silent and still, without trying to fill the room with the authority that had always arrived before him. She looked around the cedar cabinets, at the room that had hidden the lie, and now held everything needed to expose it. Convene them here. No ballroom, ceremony hall, or stage your mother can arrange. Put every ledger on the table and make the family look at what it refused to see. Jae-won nodded once. Here. This time, it sounded less like agreement than a vow. The family council convened in the archive wing 4 days later. It was a room built for evidence, not performance, and Soo-ah understood the disadvantage when she entered. The cedar cabinets stood open. Original ledgers lay beneath protective sheets. Robert Whitmore's photograph faced the 11 people who controlled the Choi ports, security divisions, freight companies, political relationships, and private agreements excluded from ordinary corporate minutes. Jae-won stood beside Mireille rather than behind his mother's chair. Park Dae-sung remained near the door. Yoona sat at the far end as Minho's representative. Before Jae-won began, Choi Song-min of the San Francisco branch placed a succession memorandum on the table. A transfer delayed by family scandal requires an emergency leadership vote. You filed that 6 hours after my mother lost archive access, before anyone outside this room knew why, Jae-won said. We will discuss your information source after the falsified record. The room changed. Song-min leaned back, no longer looking like a man arriving to collect an abandoned throne. Jae-won presented the original ledger alteration, Soo-ah's 1994 authorization, and her recent order describing the watch as suitable for public heirloom presentation. 31 years ago, Robert Whitmore disabled an explosive device attached to my father's car while our security team was still responding. He refused payment and asked only that this family remember him. He placed the old photograph beside the documents. My father held the watch as collateral for a promise he never completed openly. My mother changed its classification, erased Robert Whitmore's name, and used my son's blessing ceremony to convert that false record into public memory. The witnesses were selected because their applause would make the lie harder to challenge. An elder studied the ink through Mireille's magnifier. Another compared the secretary's handwriting from surrounding pages. Park gave his account. The retired secretary joined by secure video and confirmed the disputed entry was not his. This is documented fraud inside the family archive, Jae-won said. Not gossip, not sentiment. Soo-ah's spine remained straight. I protected the succession from a story our rivals would interpret as weakness. Song-min almost smiled. Jae-won saw it. And there is proof your strategy failed. The man most eager to exploit the truth is inside our bloodline, holding a memorandum prepared before the evidence appeared. Song-min's smile vanished. A family that survived because an outsider acted with courage is not weak, Jae-won continued. A family that falsifies history because it fears gratitude is. He turned to Mireille. State what the record requires. Mireille rose. Restore Robert Whitmore's ownership of the watch, followed by a documented transfer allowing Minho to retain it. Establish independent archive governance. No family head should alter provenance, remove names, or reclassify protected property without council review and the archivist's signed approval. And the false entry? An elder asked. Preserve it, Mireille said. Mark it fraudulent and attach the evidence. Erasing the erasure would repeat the offence. That answer moved through the room more powerfully than vengeance. Jae-won placed his signet ring on the table, the symbol required for the succession oath. The transfer remains suspended until these reforms are ratified. If exposing my own house makes me unfit, vote now. But understand the choice. Whether the next leader may rewrite evidence whenever truth becomes inconvenient. Nobody reached for the ballot box. He proposed independent authority for Mireille, removal of Soo-ah's archive privileges, and suspension of her council seat pending review. The measures passed 9 votes to 2. Song-min and Soo-ah cast the opposing votes. Yoona closed her eyes when the vote was counted, not relieved exactly, but steadied by the knowledge that her son would inherit a truthful story instead of another carefully arranged silence from the adults around him. Park allowed himself the smallest smile. Soo-ah searched the faces around the table for the invisible strings she had once pulled so easily. None remained. And my standing? Suspended by the council you manipulated, Jae-won said. Not by an angry son. You taught me never to leave power in one person's hands. I finally listened. For the first time, Soo-ah looked old rather than untouchable. She rose, smoothed her ivory silk with unsteady hands, and walked the archive beneath the eyes of the people whose memory she had tried to control. No one stopped her. The loss was quieter than humiliation and more permanent. The room continued without her. The weeks that followed were quieter than Mireille had expected consequences to be. There was no scandal in the papers, No public unraveling the Choi family's business held, its shipping contracts unaffected, its reputation among partners untouched, because the reckoning had happened exactly where Jae-won had chosen to put it, inside the family, on the family's own terms, witnessed by the people who actually needed to see it. That, Mireille understood eventually, was its own kind of consequence. Soo-ah did not lose her home, or her comfort, or her place at family dinners. She lost the one thing she had spent 30 years protecting at any cost, the ability to decide, alone, what the family's history was allowed to say about itself. The council took up her case in closed session twice that autumn. Mireille was not invited to either meeting, and did not ask to be. It wasn't her fight to referee. It was enough that the fight was finally happening in the open, on paper, with witnesses, instead of in a locked drawer 30 years deep. Baek did not leave the family, though for a week Mireille genuinely thought she might. Instead, she asked Jae-won for one thing in exchange for her silence about nothing, because there was nothing left to be silent about. That Minho be told the true story of the watch himself, in age-appropriate language, from his father directly, rather than let him keep believing the version Soo-ah had built for him. Jae-won agreed before she finished the sentence. Mireille heard, second-hand, that the boy had cried a little and then asked, with the specific bluntness of an 8-year-old, whether he still got to keep the watch. He did. Nobody suggested otherwise. The watch had never been the problem. What had been done with the silence around it was. Park Dae-sung retired that winter, 3 years earlier than he'd planned, and told Mireille over his last cup of coffee at the security post that he'd been carrying Robert Whitmore's name for 31 years, the way some men carry a splinter they've stopped noticing until someone finally pulls it out. "I should have told you the day of the funeral," he said. "I told myself it wasn't my story to tell. I've thought about it since, and I think that was true, and also a very convenient thing to believe." He shook her hand at the gate the way he might have shaken her father's, if the two men had ever had the chance to stand in the same room as equals, and told her, gruffly, that her father would have been proud of the woman who finally made the family say his name out loud. 6 weeks later, Jae-won found Mireille in the archive on a Sunday, the one day she still came from habit rather than obligation. He stopped at the threshold and knocked against the open door. "I'm not here about the council," he said. "The revised charter is in your inbox, and I did not approve it before you reviewed it." "Progress," she said, setting down her pen. In the weeks since the vote, he had done what apologies rarely survived long enough to become, changed his habits. He asked before moving records. He included her in meetings where the archive was discussed. When a branch captain called her appointment sentimental compensation, Jae-won handed him the governance charter and made him repeat the objection with Mireille present. He did not defend her competence for her. He required the man to challenge it to her face. Now uncertainty sat strangely on him, more revealing than confidence. "I've spent 3 years noticing you, and pretending restraint meant respect," he said. "I noticed when you rebuilt this wing, caught the missing shipping manifests, and stayed late because my mother kept creating standards she hoped you would fail. I admired how you never asked anyone to make room for you. I also benefited from it. Admiration is convenient when it asks nothing of the person doing it. I know, so I am asking." He held her gaze. "May I take you to dinner somewhere that does not belong to my family, employ my staff, or appear on a council calendar? Is this gratitude? No. Rebellion against your mother? No. Guilt wearing an expensive coat? Possibly some guilt. The coat is mine." His answer remained serious. "I care about you. I think I have for longer than I allowed myself to name it. I am not asking that feeling to erase what happened or reward me for finally behaving like an adult." Mireille felt the old instinct rise, make the moment easy, accept before he could withdraw it, be grateful that a powerful man had chosen honesty. She let it pass. "I want to keep running this archive under my own authority," she said. "I want disagreement without retaliation. I want you to ask rather than decide, especially when you believe you are protecting me. And I want time to discover whether the man who faced his counsel is the same man who appears when there is no audience. He is trying to be. Trying is not being. No. But it is something I can prove repeatedly." She studied him, not the head of the Choi family, not the employer who once mistook her competence for evidence she needed nothing, but a man waiting for an answer he could not command. "Dinner," she said. One dinner. Slowly. Relief crossed his face. Slowly. And no private dining room cleared by security. He glanced toward the corridor, where 2 guards had positioned themselves out of sight. That may require negotiation. Then consider it your first test. He laughed, quietly and without authority, and the sound changed the room more than a declaration. Mireille picked up her pen. 7 o'clock. Wait outside until I finish. Jae-won stepped back across the threshold. I can do that. This time, when he waited, neither of them mistook silence for control. 6 months later, the plaque went up in the archive's main corridor, small, unglamorous, exactly where Mireille had insisted it belong, not the courtyard, not the ceremony hall, just the working hallway where every member of the family walked past it on ordinary days. In memory of Robert Whitmore, 1962-2022. His courage made this family's survival possible. His name will not be erased again. Mireille had argued for weeks against anything grander, no gold lettering, no dedication ceremony, nothing that would turn her father into the kind of symbol Suar had once tried to make of him. Just a plain plaque, in a hallway people actually used, where a name could sit quietly and simply be true every single day, instead of only on the days someone decided it was convenient to remember. Minho still wore the watch on its chain, and had taken, in the months since the council meeting, to asking Mireille questions about the man whose initials he carried around his neck, what he sounded like, what he did for work, whether he would have liked him. She answered every one of them, patiently, the way she wished someone had once answered hers, pulling the old photograph from her bag one afternoon and letting the boy hold it while she pointed out which of the 2 grinning young men was his grandfather's friend, and which one was the stranger who'd saved his family. Minho studied it for a long time, the way children study things they're deciding whether to believe, and then asked, with the specific gravity of an 8-year-old handed something important, whether he could keep a copy for himself. She had one printed that week. Denise called that same week to ask how it had all landed once the council dust had settled and the plaque was finally up. You asked, Mireille told her. Out loud. More than once. It didn't fix everything. It didn't undo 4 years of not knowing, or 31 years of a debt nobody let my father collect while he was alive to want it. But nobody in that house gets to pretend the truth was never asked for again. That's the whole job, Denise said. Not fixing everything. Just making sure the asking finally happened. The watch had opened, once, as a wound dressed up as a gift. It had closed, finally, as something closer to what it should have been from the start. Proof that a man's name could survive the people who tried hardest to bury it, if someone loved him enough to go looking, and stubborn enough to keep looking after every closed door told her to stop. Should Jae-won have handed his mother away back onto the council? Or does 30 years of erasing the truth deserve to cost her that seat permanently? Tell me what you'd have done in her place.